Mike, and I'd like to welcome our next presenter, Ted Truska, who is the Sea Lamprey Program Manager at the Great Lakes Fishery Commission, and he's going to talk to us about lessons learned from 2020 and what happens if we do reduce sea lamprey control. Take it away, Ted.
Thanks, John. I'm presenting today in place of Ben Marcy-Quay, our USGS colleague that wasn't able to travel here today. This is his talk. I've tried to understand as much as I can. I hopefully won't slaughter too bad, but he did a lion's share of the work along with a lot of cooperators from various agencies, many of whom are in the room today. So a lot of appreciation for all the work that's gone into this project. So control in 2020 and 2021, as most people know, a lot of things happened in 2020 that we couldn't control, and a lot of these impacts had direct results on the Great Lakes as we know them. So the travel restrictions in 2020 and 2021 are especially tough on sea lamprey control. Things shut down right as we were gearing up for the field season in March, and a lot of effects have trickled down from that. We saw 70% of planned treatments were deferred in Superior, Michigan, and Huron, and 100% of the treatments in Erie and Ontario were also deferred. So the lower lakes were particularly affected, especially since they're far from our control stations. We couldn't make it to them. There was no overnight travel, a lot of other restrictions. There was the border crossing issue that DFO couldn't come into New York to control the south side of Lake Ontario. It was just a kerfluffle. So, and these issues didn't fully let up in 2021 either. While more travel was possible, the lower lakes were still a problem. They're still a long ways away. There are still restrictions in place on a number of different aspects of what we could do. And in fact, a lot of the control that was possible in the lower lakes was due to the help of the Lake Champlain Fish and Wildlife Service office that does sea lamprey control and was able to come over and help. So this map shows a pretty clear picture of the impacts of the restrictions. What you'll see here is the control stations that we have in the boxes, one in Marquette up on Lake Superior, one on the eastern shore of Lake Michigan in Ludington, another one in Sault Ste. Marie. As you can see, those offices are fairly far from the places where we are today. And the colored dots represent the treatments throughout that were planned for 2020 and then kind of followed up in 2021 and 2022. So you'll see the blue ones, which are clustered mainly around the control stations where they could go to within a day and come back, are the ones that were actually able to be done in 2020. The yellow are the ones that were scheduled but not treated in 2020, and the red ones are the worst case scenario that were scheduled but not treated in 2020 or 2021. So even after 2021, there were still a lot of impacts to the control program, but they're a bit harder to quantify, where there's a lot of knock-on effects. So if we can't go to a stream in a year, that stream pretty much almost goes to the top of the list for the next year, and that may push something off the further end of the list. These streams, the reason we're going to these streams is because they have large larvae that are ready to go out to the lakes and feed on fish. If we can't get there, it's a bad thing. So we try and get there as soon as those large larvae are close to or ready to go out to the lake. And the great thing is that we can actually kill the other age classes that are younger than those larvae. So the large larvae are in there, but there's also usually 2 or 3 other age classes that we get with each treatment. So everything led to a conflict, in sea lamprey control, but it also led to a perfect opportunity to better understand the importance of control. This was kind of like a forbidden experiment or taboo topic to talk about what happens if we don't do control. And so COVID gave us an example of what happens when we do that. So we took the opportunity after the fact, after we wrung our hands and cried in our beer a bit, to realize that this is an opportunity to figure out what happens if we can't do control on the lake. Luckily, it was fairly limited in its scope in Lake Ontario. Sorry, Lake Ontario, but it is what it is. But we looked at it as an opportunity to figure out what exactly would be the impacts. So we'd made lemons from lemonade. And so what really happened? First was a lull. As you expect, lamprey typically spend 3 to 5 years as larvae in the stream feeding on sediments. Then they metamorphose and migrate out to the lake, feed on fish. And we try and prevent that from happening by treating before they get to that magic length of metamorphosis. With the delay in treatment, it's clear that many of these larvae were going to out-migrate and start feeding before we could get a lampricide treatment could be applied. One of the things that we had kind of on our side was we were using the targeted treatment strategy in the upper lakes due to some what seemed to be kind of control issues up there. We were seeing more lamprey than we hoped to see, so a lot of effort was being expended in the upper lakes. And so it was a kind of a rotational thing where we'd focus on one lake for each year and hit it pretty hard, which meant we were also treating down and catching these larvae earlier in life, so there weren't as many larger stage larvae that were ready to go out. The lower lakes were showing signs that they're fairly well under control, so we weren't doing we weren't treating further down in the lower lakes, which may have led to some of the impacts in Lake Ontario, but it's really hard to tell. And they were doing fairly well, being fairly consistent around target levels where we like them to be. And then the effects of what was happening became more obvious, both mainly from the angler perspective at first. These are photos of fish that were being observed in Lake Ontario in 2022. These are photos that were passed on to our communications folks as they went out to outreach events and talked to anglers. Everyone was talking about what they were seeing. They were talking about how 2022 in Lake Ontario was unlike anything they'd seen before. This is a picture that gets a lot of play. There's 4 juvenile lamprey that were attached to this fish after it came in the boat. We saw a lot of fish with multiple wounds. Each one of these lamprey has really taken the lifeblood right out of this fish. I'm guessing this fish probably hasn't been attacked for very long. It's still fairly robust, but you can see some fish that really show the impacts of the lamprey predation. So, and as you'd hope, I guess, or not, the fisheries monitoring data backed up these angler observations as well. This is a fairly complicated slide, so I'm going to spend some time on it. So this plot shows some of that data. So in the top panel is the adult sea lamprey index for the last 20 so odd years. That's based on standardized trapping at a number of uniform sites around each of the lakes. The bottom panels are an index of sea lamprey wounding that we use that are observed on lake trout from assessment netting and other efforts. In each panel, the green dots represent the observed data and the purple dots represent the modeled data. And as you can see, in most cases it's almost hard to see the green dots, and just because they overlap very well, correspond. And the purple range is what we'd expect based on the variation in that lake over time, along with the previous year's data. So we kind of, the way the purple normal range was calculated was based on what we see in the lake over time and the previous year. The blue interval that you'll see at the end of these time series is what we kind of expected given normal conditions. The yellow is what we actually did see, and as you'll see, especially in Lake Ontario, to some extent in Lake Michigan and Lake Erie, we saw some fairly rapid increases in sea lamprey abundance. Nowhere is it more obvious than in Lake Ontario. And we also saw some minor upticks in Lake Michigan and Lake Huron and Lake Ontario in terms of lake trout wounding, and we'll get a little bit more into that into the next slides. In Lake Ontario, we have further exploration of the data that's available there. So this is mostly possible due to extraneous data collections that are done by OM&R in New York in their salmon fisheries, salmon egg takes. So in the first row, just to kind of put everything on a timeline, in the first row in the orange we have the overall lamprey abundance. You'll see the market increase there in 2023 in the spawning run of lamprey in 2023. In the second row we have attached lamprey observations from the New York Angler Creel survey. I think that most people here are familiar with. Saw a market increase there too. In the blue in the third panel we see Chinook and coho salmon wounding on New York and Ontario hatchery assessments. So when the fish come back to spawn, they also collect lamprey wounding data. So market increases there too. And the last slide is in the green is the lake trout wounding that we saw in gillnet assessments around the lake. As you can see, there was an increase during this time, but this data is often a little bit noisier. We don't see. It was very interesting to see this because we hadn't seen a lot of this tide before. If you look at some of the data prior to 2020, you see that there is some interesting matches between the coho and Chinook with the lamprey numbers and with the lake trout numbers, but sometimes lake trout has a lot more noise in it in terms of like exactly what's happening. We don't see as marked of an increase in the lake trout numbers, and that's just something that we kind of have to tease apart. The key thing is this isn't a vacuum. That we over this time series, and this shows from 1982 to the present. We know that the fish community in Lake Ontario wasn't the same. You know, we've had boom and bust lake trout populations fluctuations in the other rest of the salmonid communities. So it's kind of hard to pull those apart. And if you want to know more about that, Gene Adams and Mike Jones wrote a great paper about host switching in lamprey in Lake Ontario, which was very interesting. So when lake trout numbers started going down, at some point they start to switch more to Chinook salmon. So what happened? Thankfully, the resumption of control had similar strong effect. So going back to those same plots, we can see that there's the yellow dot that's added here in the years after control. So this would be after we saw the spike that corresponded to 2020 and 2021. Once we started normal control back in 2022 and 2023, we saw really marked decreases in the years following those. These are all kind of delayed impacts. So when we do control, we don't see the impacts that year. We see the impacts years down the road in some cases. So we saw a lot of those marked decreases in Michigan, Erie, and Ontario. We did see some things that are a little confounding, especially in Lake Superior, but Lake Superior's kind of been a conundrum for a number of years. But we're still kind of trying to figure that part out. And going back to the slides we just looked at, and the slide we just looked at with the different metrics, you can see there was a marked decrease in just about all the metrics that we're looking at following the resumption of control efforts. So just to kind of go into, we all probably know this, but just to point out all these things, the impacts of excess wounding and the associated mortality on fish is that more wounded fish means there's fewer fish in the lake. We all know that. In lakes such as Ontario, many of those dead fish are stock fish, so those are wasted investments. Fish that taxpayer dollars or conservation dollars went forward to raising those fish, stocking those fish, are now gone. Dead fish don't spawn. Not only is this a knock on the fishery right now, it's also a fish on the fishery, the fishery of the future. In terms of lake trout, this could be affecting 10 to 20 years of lost spawning with that fish that just died, because most lamprey are attacking sexually mature fish that are reproductive. Wounded fish aren't as much fun to catch or appetizing. There's a lot of folks out there that say that the fish don't fight as much, which I assume they wouldn't, because they have a giant parasite on their side. And a lot of folks on social media will say, somebody will show a picture of a lamprey attacked fish, and some people will just say, throw it out. I just cut around it, but some people don't take that into account. And widening species impacts. As I mentioned, lamprey are adaptable. If they can't find a salmonid to feed on that they prefer, they'll go find something else. This isn't just I can't find a Chinook or a lake trout, I'll just die and starve on the bottom. They will find something else, which has knock-on effects throughout the rest of the fish community. So if we do the math in Lake Ontario, it's pretty amazing. We estimate that the pause in lamprey control resulted in 114,000 more parasitic larval lamprey in that time period. If we calculate it 40 pounds of fish per lamprey, we get 4.5 million pounds of fish were lost during that time period. And if you use the figure we use for the cost, the economic benefit of fish, that represents $100 million US just for Lake Ontario alone. So we're not talking dimes and nickels here. So just to kind of go through the conclusions, this work illustrates the need for continuous control. Even 1 year or partial reduction in control can really have real impacts in terms of what the fishery looks like and what's available for you to manage down the road. One of the silver lining things was that we were able to bring the lake back under control fairly quickly, but I have to acknowledge that this is a sample size of 1, and we all know what that kind of means. There could be a lot of caveats as to would this be the same case on a different lake? Would this be the same case on Lake Ontario 2 years down the road? We don't know that. And this proves the point of additional wounding data is important. Do other species in Lake Ontario? The data that we got was very important to show us the impacts. If we just looked at lake trout, we'd be like, oh, it's not that, we don't see that much of an impact. But with the extraneous data that we got from the agencies around the lake, it's great. We've encouraged all the agencies around the lake to collect lamprey wounding data on any species that they think may be vulnerable. Because the key part is having the pre-data. If we don't see wounding, we've seen this in other lakes where wounding on whitefish is very kind of low level, but then it ramps up. But if we don't have that pre-data, we don't know if it was always at that level or if this is something to be concerned about. And a conclusion is the realization that we have a large geographical area to cover with the control. As you can see, we're fairly limited in our locations. Travel is hard. We go to many of these locations multiple times a year. It's not just control. We just don't drive and drop chemical. Larval assessment goes out and checks things. Barrier teams go out and assess barriers, make sure they're still blocking lamprey, that they're in good shape. So we travel a long ways, and when you're a long ways from home, it's a taxing on the staff, it's taxing on resources, it costs a lot of money. To realize that we're sensitive to disruptions like COVID and whatever else might happen, as we're seeing right now. Who knows what's going to happen in 2025 given the staffing issues on the south side of the Great Lakes. So with that, I just want to acknowledge all the folks, most of who are in the room here today, that provided data and a lot of insight in terms of the analysis of all this data. And with that, I'll take any questions that I can hopefully answer.